Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kirida. I am a researcher at the Development Action Group, and I will be your host or facilitator for the day. I would just like to wish everybody a warm welcome to the online public meeting. We have many people here, and we are very glad that you've all joined us, notwithstanding the fact that we have to meet virtually. It would have been, I think, an amazing meeting if we were all able to get together and actually engage with one another in a more physical space. I am going to start immediately by introducing Adi, who is the Executive Director at the Development Action Group. Adi is going to give us a little bit of background about the purpose of today and what it is that we're hoping to achieve with this meeting. Before I do that, I do want to just say that we have ensured that everybody is muted for now, but we definitely want you to engage and participate in this conversation as much as possible. It's a public meeting, so we obviously want the public to be involved more than anybody else. So we will have plenty of opportunity for engagement. Later on, we will have a Q&A session. So leading up to that, as we listen to the presentations given by everybody else, I would kindly request that you put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. If you look towards the bottom, you'll see there's a sort of a lineup of icons, and one of them says chat. So in the chat box, if you have questions, please put your questions there. And when we get to the Q&A section later in the program, we'll refer to the chat box to have your questions, to lift your questions and have them answered by the presenters. Other than that, if your questions aren't answered during the Q&A session, please note that we will have breakaway groups where everybody again will have an opportunity to engage with the moderators and everybody within the breakaway groups to get some of those questions answered. With that said, I'm going to immediately move over to Adi, who is going to tell you what we are essentially here to do today. Adi?
Thanks, Kirida. And welcome to everyone, and not just on behalf of DAG, but all the organizations and individuals that participated in putting together this submission. So maybe just to give a little bit of context why and how this particular submission has come about and how we got to this public meeting. So firstly, just to say that the call for releasing publicly owned land is not new. It has a history that dates back decades, and it's something that's been part of kind of the municipal planning system and some of the commitments that government has made for decades now. And several organizations have been calling for, especially in the last probably 5 years, several organizations across the country have been asking for state-owned land to be released, particularly for affordable housing, whether it be related to golf courses, inner city social housing, or underutilized land that could be used for housing. Then last year, something quite radical happened. COVID-19 struck. And big debates took place at the national department, at the provincial department, at the city, generally around what the response for housing and land rights has been over the last 2.5 decades. And from the special repertoire of housing to various experts and community residents, stories were emerging across, and a call was emerging for the need and the right for adequate housing. And clearly that we haven't done enough as a country to get to the point where everybody has a roof over their head and has enough access to land and housing in that particular context. So as a result of various conversations, a number of organizations, and I'll mention them by name, Ndifuna Ukwazi, who's here as well, Legal Resource Center, the South African Slum Dwellers International Alliance, comprising of CORK, Informal Settlement Network, and the Federation of the Urban Poor, Development Action Group, which I represent, and Professor Vanessa Watson from UCT, came together to really develop a compelling case for 3 particular parcels of land that have had a historical commitment around them. These 3 being Wingsfield, Youngsfield, and Jasterplaat. The confluence of these organizations is particularly important, I think, from the context that it brings together skills and expertise around both legal matters and legal interpretation of the current law, but also the developmental thinking and the planning experience that is required to put these. And really the idea in this particular instance was not just to put the onus of release of these parcels of land on the state, but perhaps guide and shape what gets developed on these particular parcels. So in many ways, kind of the underpinnings of this submission was to really get deeper forms of public engagement, to get different forms of social compacts, different ways of working in which if land is released, how it could be developed for the people that we all care about and people who live without housing at the moment. A number of organizations besides the one that put together the submission endorsed the submission, and ultimately this submission was submitted to the presidency last year in the fourth quarter. The submission from the presidency was ultimately directed to the National Department of Human Settlements, and we haven't necessarily received a response from the National Department just yet. The department that picked up the submission and kind of worked with us was the Department of Public Works, and Minister DeLille, close to the end of last year, had a with us to reaffirm kind of her support around the release of land generally, and specifically saying how she, while she was in the mayoral position in Cape Town, had also kind of highlighted the release of various parcels of land for social housing and so on. Unfortunately, the minister could not attend the meeting today, even though she had a standing commitment. And as many of you know, she has contracted the virus and is unable to make it. So we wish her a speedy recovery. But I think the commitment from the minister is twofold. One is obviously for the release of state land, particularly these 3 parcels of land, and then also to make some kind of a public announcement at some point that reaffirms clarity around both timeframes, but also around what the nature of the release of these parcels of land would entail. The submission was also shared with the Western Cape province in the city of Cape Town. And the province, for multiple reasons, has said that they cannot necessarily comment or support or deny anything in this submission, as they're strictly working through the intergovernmental relationships and through the IGR framework. The city of Cape Town has engaged with the submission on one occasion and has requested some time to deliberate internally. But then they used a very effective tool, a very modern tool called Twitter to respond to us, reaffirming the support for the release of these lands. And this was in response to an interview that took place a week ago, and the city reaffirmed that the city of Cape Town does not own these parcels of land, and that they are fully in support of these parcels of land be released immediately. And they even give some or allude to some methods in which the land could be released, which is through a power of attorney to the Housing Development Agency, and through that particular process, utilizing the land to be developed and feasibility studies be conducted. This was subsequently confirmed when you open the latest spatial development framework and the district planning process that is underway by the city of Cape Town, where Wingsfield has been identified as a potential area for development in the future. So in many ways, this is quite a historic moment, particularly for housing and land activists across the country. The national and the local are very much aligned in terms of the developmental priorities, that these 3 particular parcels of land are very significant in that particular story. So part of the reason for this meeting is besides kind of sharing the information about these parcels of land and some of the kind of very, very preliminary thinking that these set of organizations have put on the table. But the real drivers of this particular meeting is that where are we going to find 600 hectares of land within 10 kilometers of the CBD? Where are we going to find such parcels of land that can house anywhere between like 45 to 65,000 households within the inner city? So I think this has to become the key priority, not just for the next few months, but also given that the elections are coming up, has to become almost like a significant priority in the local government elections. So the aspiration of this meeting is twofold. One is to share some of the informations and details that we've learned, both from a legalistic perspective, but as much from the developmental perspective, and see what the development potential of these particular sites are. But really the underpinning of this is to figure out the principles and the values under which this land would be released, and how this land could be unlocked, and for housing for who, and housing for what purpose, and for what income brackets, and so on. So it's really about getting some of the broad kind of momentum from the public around this particular release of land, and get some detail in terms of how this discussion could be taken forward in coordination and collaboration with civil society. And ultimately, these organizations are not in any way representing or becoming the mouthpiece of any constituency in Cape Town or across the country. I think the point is to open up this debate, to open this debate up in a way that people can engage directly with the issues and perhaps lead to a different development model than we've seen so far in the city. So with those words, Kirida, I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Adi. I think it's great to hear that there is commitment from various sectors within government to this. And what we want to sort out now is, I guess, the nuts and bolts of how we get this land released and then go on to develop the sites. With that said, I think it's really important that we also get some background about the sites and what they are and what our actual ask is. So I'm going to ask Ryan from DAG and Michael from Ndifuna Ukwazi to speak next or give their presentation. They're going to talk a little bit about the sites and give us more detail about the developmental potential about these sites. Ryan and Michael, are you ready?
Yes.
Yes, we are ready. We're ready to go. So I will present today, myself and Michael, on the release of the military land for affordable housing. And like Kirida said, the nuts and bolts of it and what it means. And then Michael will take us through some of the legal stuff towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to try and make my screen full screen and then we can take it from there. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my presentation. I know there's always sometimes issues with these Zoom meetings, but we'll take it from there. So, yeah, essentially, in terms of the release of the military land for affordable housing, we did some intensive planning work with the other partner organizations, DAG, LRC, NU, and Cork, and Professor Vanessa Watson from UCT around what these land parcels mean in terms of city making, the location, the strategic nature of the location, and the opportunity that it presents to us being vacant state-owned land. And I'm sure many of you who dwell or live in the Cape Town area will know that the land parcels are very strategically located and there's definite strategic advantages for their location, being close to some of the major urban nodes in the city of Cape Town. So, of course, the land parcels we know are close to existing economic and industrial nodes, and they offer considerable employment opportunities for those who will live on this land parcel. So it's important not to just develop vacant land, but it's important to develop vacant land close to economic opportunities where people can live, work, and play, and also attend school. So in terms of education, the sites are also very close to various primary schools and high schools, social facilities, and health facilities. And then another big part of it is that they're also in close proximity to bus, taxi, and public transit, and particularly close to a number of train stations and bus stops. And as you can see the map that I have on the screen, you would see that besides Youngsfield, but most of them, all three sites generally fall within a radius of about 10 to 15 kilometers from the Cape Town CBD. And I think that's an important point as to stress the importance of developing these sites for affordable housing, because when it comes to the spatial restructuring of our city and addressing apartheid spatial planning legacies, these sites offer a valuable opportunity to change the way our city is in terms of location and in terms of offering better services to the lower income groups and more vulnerable income groups in our society. So Easterplaat and Wingfield, which are the top two, fall within an area that is also specifically identified by the city and the province as an urban development corridors. And I'm going to take you through some of the strategic advantages of these three locations, and then we're going to talk through how we see the development unfolding in a more incremental manner. So the first one we have on the screen is Youngsfield, and this map is basically an opportunities and constraints map, and it just shows the location of Youngsfield to different economic corridors and zones. But I think what's important is the location of Youngsfield to the different universities, to different schools. As you can see, there's about 157 schools within a 5-kilometer catchment area from Youngsfield itself, and 2 universities. And then it's also close to 2 major commercial centers, particularly the Wynberg Main Road and the Wetton Road Economic Corridor. So once again, very well located, and we're looking, if we look at a density of about 60 dwelling units per hectare, you know, these sites can, the Youngsfield site can deliver about 8,502 homes on the 141.7 hectare site that it is. And then moving to the Easterplat and Wingfield, also once again very well located to the schools. That's both primary, high school, and ECD centers, or early childhood development centers, and it's close to 3 major commercial centers, as well as the Voortrekker Road Economic Corridor, Century City, and then also the Cape Town CBD, which is not too far off. I think also one thing that's quite important that we considered in our submission is also the location of these sites to clinics, because that's always a great need in our communities, the location of sites to clinics and how accessible these sites are. And I think for both Youngsfield, Easterplat, and Wingfield, we have about 18 clinics within the 5-kilometer catchment area. And 5 kilometers is something that we worked with, you know, because it's walkable, and these services would definitely be accessible if people are living on these sites. We looked at the potential yields based on different policy documents from the City of Cape Town, and also some best practice around social housing. Not that we're necessarily prescribing social housing, but just using them as indicators. If we look at the Easterplat, which is about 255.8 hectares, you're looking at about 75, the second column, 75 dwelling units per hectare at gross rate. It will yield about 19,185 homes, while if you're looking at 100 dwelling units per hectare, which is basically where the policy, like the district plans and spatial development frameworks are pitching high density development, you're looking at about 25,580 homes. So the City of Cape Town makes reference to the potential yields of all 3 in their district plan. And we also acknowledge that when densities are higher than 60 dwelling units per hectare, will also require upgrades to local bulk infrastructure systems. But we also believe that if we're looking at anything below 60 dwelling units per hectare, we're also undercapitalizing on the unique opportunities these sites present. And if you read the policy documents, you'll also know that higher densities do provide and create the conditions for an efficient and sustainable public transport system, as well as supporting public facilities. So we wouldn't want to look at anything below 60 dwelling units per hectare, but 60 dwelling units and up, that's kind of where we're looking at, just to create that density that will enable public transport and economic opportunities. And then also just to go through Wingfield and Youngsfield. So Wingfield, 270.1 hectares, that's the biggest one of the sites, and we're looking, that can yield at about 75 dwelling units per hectare, 20,258 homes. And then Youngsfield, 141.7 hectares, that can yield about 10,628 homes at 75 dwelling units per hectare. So one can see that these 3 sites that total about 668 hectares can deliver a significant amount of homes if they are developed to the correct densities. And that can really create a major dent in our housing backlog and housing crisis. So I'm going to talk through how we foresee the sites developing. And we're going to go through about 3 diagrams, just going through the different phases. But essentially, the vision for these sites is to create developments that are socially, economically, and physically integrated. And the character of each will be informed by its location and adjacencies, which are outlined in these diagrams that I'm about to talk about. In each case, the majority of the site should be planned to accommodate a mix of housing and tenure types, ranging from medium density single residential units to high density jurisdictional title blocks with the emphasis on the former. These areas have the potential to demonstrate an effective and well-managed approach to the combination of self-build, incremental and market housing, and a phased approach to increasing the density to match the surrounding bulk upgrades and decreasing the overall lead times by adopting a package of plans approach. And so the images we're going to look at now, they contain a detailed design and development approach to dealing with opportunities and constraints of these land parcels. So with the image that you see on the screen right now, and everything that I'm talking through, you'll find in the submission. So if you require any details, more details after this session today, you might want to look at the submission. But basically in the initial phase, which is literally the contextual framework, we set out the access proposals and land use and planning principles. And this phase, which is at the very beginning, sets up the open space network and link into and extend local economic corridors and public transport routes. And this sets up the bones of the future development, starting with a medium density of about 40 to 60 dwelling units per hectare. And what we're looking at in this phase is initially 2 to 4 stories, as well as well-structured self-build options. So this is at the very beginning of development, and we're looking at about a medium density of about 40 to 60 dwelling units per hectare, and that's about 2 to 4 stories high. Then in terms of the intermediate phase, in this phase, you start to set out the precinct, subdivision, and site development plans. And the intermediate phase is where the actual development sees the explosion of incremental housing opportunities and the overall densification of the initial phase, which we saw in the previous slide, taking us to the range of about 40 to 100 dwelling units per hectare. So in this phase, additional packages are developed to include some high density typologies, which will trigger additional commercial as well as informal trading. At this phase, the access to public transport routes and hubs become vital to the new residents traveling for work or education, and extensions are implemented along main economic corridors. Adjacent development is likely to be stimulated and the expansion of communal facilities is triggered. A careful approach to design of open spaces is essential, as well as the incorporation of wetlands. And all three of the sites do have wetlands, and I think it's very important that we consider these wetlands will enhance the sites when it comes to the designing and planning. And then in the advanced phase, we simply see the development of the tools of the housing developments, and we kind of also did like some 3D sketching. But at this phase, we see that the development will be a minimum of 2 stories, with the majority at about 4 to 5 stories, and the overall density of the areas within about 40 to 100 dwelling units per hectare. So the high density typologies will be used as buffers along key arterial roads, new public transport interchange. And at this phase, we also see well-established and intensified commercial and civic centers become local economic hubs. So this advanced phase, we see these sites becoming essentially neighborhoods, with their own commercial and public transport interchanges. And we definitely see the maximum, like I said in the previous table, about to be 40 to 100 dwelling units per hectare, and I think less than that. So that's the 3 different phases we see we foresee these sites taking on. Obviously, when it comes to actual implementation, things might unfold differently, but this is just to essentially give you an idea of what is possible on these sites. That we can actually achieve something of a great scale. And it's literally, if I go to the next slide, this is Easterblood. But if you look at that, that is a completely new neighborhood that we're building, and that really has the potential to change the character of the city in a good way, and also enable and achieve the objectives of spatial restructuring to address the apartheid spatial legacies. So I'm going to hand over to Michael from Ndifuna Ukwazi, who's going to take you through some of the legal mechanisms around releasing the state-owned land.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and thanks for those taking us through those great plans. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think a lot of what I want to say is simply 2 things. One is that the Constitution really requires of government at all levels of government to really meaningfully address spatial apartheid and the legacy of spatial apartheid. And that's clear from various sections in the Constitution. Section 25(5) of the Constitution, which places an obligation on the state to ensure that citizens progressively gain access to land on an equitable basis, as well as Section 26 of the Constitution, which gives everyone a right of access to adequate housing. And those are progressive rights that need to be progressively realized. But what is clear is both of them are aimed at addressing some kind of inequality that exists at the moment. And the courts have recently in the Tafelberg judgment, while that judgment is still subject to appeal, have shed some light on how courts are likely to interpret these different rights together in the future. And that's a very interesting element to this debate, that there is this duty to really address the spatial legacy of apartheid, and this is not something that's going to go away. And that means that location becomes important. It's not enough for the government to simply provide housing in any area or in really poorly located areas on the outskirts of towns or cities, where that land is located and where those houses are located also become a crucial factor, because we need to start addressing this legacy of spatial apartheid. Ryan, we can go to the next slide. And so I wanted to add this quote from this High Court decision, the Adonisi case or the Tafelberg case, where the court specifically said that these rights, when they're read together, actually create this need to urgently address apartheid's shameful and divisive legacy of spatial injustice and manifest inequality. Ryan, we can go to the next slide. So shifting tack a little bit, one of the key things that we wanted to also address with our submission was to unpack whether there are any legal barriers that are preventing this land to be released, and specifically these 3 sites to be released for the development of affordable housing. So we looked comprehensively at the existing laws and policies that exist at the moment and tried to see if there were ways that would allow either the Minister of Public Works, the Minister of Human Settlements, or the President to release this land for the development of affordable housing. And we found many different laws and policies that actually exist, and many different mechanisms that could be used to release this land. The state could transfer this land in terms of the Government Immovable Asset Management Act, or the State Land Disposal Act, or even the Housing Development Agency Act. It could acquire this land through a range of different government housing programs, specifically there the Integrated Residential Development Program, or the Upgrading of Informal Settlements Program, or it could even expropriate in extreme circumstances this land in terms of Section 9 of the Housing Act or the Expropriation Act. And I mentioned this all simply to show that there are legal mechanisms that exist at this moment in our law and in our policy framework that would allow this land to be released for the development of social or affordable housing. And so all that's really needed here at this point in time is for the government to really have the political will to actually activate that and actually implement those decisions and use those mechanisms effectively. The other thing that we looked at was we started identifying which types of government housing programs could be used to develop the site itself. In the submission we made, we identified a range of different programs, from the emergency housing program, the upgrading of informal settlements program, to the integrated residential development program. And what we really suggested at the end was to adopt a package of plans approach to be able to target many different types of housing and also different income brackets. And that would allow this ability for the sites to be incrementally developed, which would not only address urgent needs in the immediate term, but would also really start to build those inclusive neighborhoods over time that we were really wanting to unpack with these parcels of land. So that's essentially it. There is a lot more detail to all of this in our submission, but I think people sometimes get lost in the detail, and I think that the main takeaway point here is that the mechanisms exist, the release is possible, and so is the development in terms of our existing laws and policies. We now said that we wanted to show a short video that gives a little bit more context to the call that we made. And I'm sure that the host will now run that.
Cape Town's current land and housing crisis is informed by various complex issues that warrant addressing. The first, of course, is it's rooted in a very violent historical, colonial and apartheid context, where during both these eras, the colonial era as well as the apartheid era, spatial planning made it difficult, if not definitely impossible, for a majority of the people to gain access to land in a meaningful way. This was done, of course, through various mechanisms at a time where dispossession more than access was the norm. And this being done through the state machinery, supported, of course, by very exclusionary laws and policies, which meant that people, particularly Black people, could not have access to title to land. And even if they had some form of access to land, that title was extremely insecure and could prompt and inform displacement from various parts of the city. And so it is in this context that the authors of this submission to the president have called for specific intervention towards alleviating this huge and complex problem, which is to unlock well-located parcels of land that are owned by the national government as a means to begin to address the legacy of apartheid spatial planning, but also meaningfully address a host of issues, being this housing crisis, as well as the deepening inequality that we can see, yes, not just in Cape Town and across the city, across the cities in South Africa, and the need to unlock parcels of land is a critical mechanism towards addressing these issues.
So the core of the submission that we're submitting to the presidency is really focusing on the release of 3 parcels of land in Cape Town, Yesterplaat, Wingsfield and Youngsfield. The cumulative 3 land parcels amount to about 688 hectares of land within 10 kilometers of the CBD. These are located in very well located areas, economic corridors, industrial areas, proximity to schools, to health clinics and all of those pieces. And we estimate, just by conservative measures, that this could probably take care of about 30% of the housing backlog that City of Cape Town currently experiences. There's about 350,000 households that live in informal structures, in poor shelter conditions, and this would probably provide anywhere between 40 to 70,000 homes for people that are desperately looking for homes. So, I mean, these sites have been vacant for a very long time, and from DAG's perspective, our first publication in 1991, which was a hard print, spoke about these 3 parcels of land being very essential if we have to address any kind of housing backlog and housing rights issues in Cape Town. And those parcels are still sitting vacant. There are serious environmental concerns and some of the other concerns, but they far outstrip the amount of housing that they could provide for the poor.
Cape Town has one of the most exclusionary housing markets in the country, and indeed, if looked at on a broader scale, in the world. This is related to, of course, the sheer inability for people to afford access to their homes, and even when they do have an ability to perhaps secure a loan, a mortgage, and afford their homes, this is not something that is sustainable. Including those who are renting their homes. And that inaffordability has of course been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and the inability for people to secure employment or to secure full-time employment, and indeed have access to their jobs during this most difficult past period.
Obviously, the current approach to housing has been really about cheap land and poor location, and that's really transferring the burden of transportation, of housing costs, of poor land markets and exclusionary land markets, particularly in the inner city, to the poor on the periphery. And these particular parcels could make a significant dent, not just on bringing people close to the inner city to economic opportunities, but also perhaps really make an inroad in providing people with access to housing in a very different terms and conditions. I guess one of the big advantages to these sites, besides being within the 10-kilometer radius of CBD, is the fact they sit between massive trunk lines and bulk infrastructure, water, sanitation, and so on, along and adjoining and adjacent to well-serviced neighborhoods in that respect. So that allows it a much easier unlocking of these parcels of land, just by virtue of the negligible cost that would have to go and the negligible investment that would have to go compared to a greenfield site on the periphery of the city.
Acting on releasing these parcels of land is something that is rooted in various pieces of legislation and existing obligations that all levels of government have. The first worth mentioning is the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, a relatively new piece of legislation from 2014, which really addresses the need for all levels of government to to advance the principle of spatial justice, which in our context definitely would have implications for where and when developments are being made.
These particular parcels of land have been earmarked for a long time to be released. I think the first IDPs, which came out from 1999 to 2001, already earmarked these parcels of land. So this is not a new commitment that the presidency is making. I think this is a commitment that's a historical commitment to release these parcels of land for the purposes of housing and for the urban poor. Unfortunately, none of that has materialized, and despite the claims by the National Department of Public Works or from the National Department of Human Settlements to the presidency, these three parcels, through repeated commitments, continue to remain passive and underutilized in that particular process. So the submission is really looking at different ways in which we could propose different housing typologies, different ways using these three sites as a way of leapfrogging into getting the state to commit to release large tracts of land which it's been holding for the last 25 years. So that's the real ask in this submission, and as we're talking to various community networks, to various community groups, organizations, social movements, we're seeing a strong appetite from the communities to really say, but asking the same questions: why is this land not being released? Why is this land not being utilized for housing since it's already underutilized? So I think those are the questions that we're asking. Through this submission, we're also requesting the presidency for a focused engagement where we could have a discussion, we could present our ideas, we could share thoughts and perhaps present some kind of direction to the national departments in the manner in which they could release these particular parcels of land.
Thank you, Adam. I think those images in the video really makes one think about the people that live in deplorable circumstances in South Africa and the ones really who would be the beneficiaries of this land being made available. And with that said, I am going to ask some of our community partners who's going to give a response or describe to us a little bit about how their circumstances are, and maybe just give us a better idea about how having these land parcels available for affordable housing would impact their lives. First up, we're going to have Unati Dayantia. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your surname. Speak. Unati lives in ERF 81, and Unati is going to speak a little bit about the experiences of the people living on ERF 81. Unati, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Unati Kyanji. Can you still see me and hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes, Unati.
Okay. So my name is Unati Kyanji. I live in Tambuskloof in an old military base, just between Tambuskloof and Bokap. I've been living there since 2013. And when we moved there with a group of friends, we were looking for a piece of land where we could, start a garden project. And we moved into the space and we started the project. And we then ran a Sunday weekly market. And most of the traders that were in our market were from the community and from places like the township. So living in the inner city in this piece of land obviously gave us economic opportunities. So we could do our project, and we were in the proximity of, of privilege as well, because our activities and our economic activities were supported by the neighbors of Tambuskloof. So, which is something we couldn't access if we were in the township. So we are a community of just under 200 people, and predominantly black and colored. We have animals on the farm, some chickens, some goats, and some sheep, one pony. We also, kind of like help the neighboring community with their waste. We collect waste. We have community gardens. We are self-sustaining, which is a great example of, how things should be, that people must be given these opportunities in spaces that allow them to develop themselves. So this has been going on for some years, until recently when the Public Works Department shut down our market and other operations. And then later on, the South African Army moved in. Now we have soldiers in the community 24 hours. So it's different now. It's not the same we expect. It's been just over a year now since the military has come to occupy within the occupation. So yeah, this is our community is really an example of how this parcels of land can help, the poor to access economic opportunities within the CBD area of Cape Town. So, I mean, you can look up ERF 81 market, and you will see a lot of videos on YouTube that have been made about our community and the potential, it has, because it is a national example of how, if people are given land in these kinds of areas, how they can, develop themselves, how we can boost the economy and fight against poverty, and unemployment. I think I'm gonna stop there. I will just maybe take questions because there's a lot I can say and I don't want to take up all the time. Thank you. Can you still hear me?
Yes. Thank you, Inati, for your inputs. I am now going to move over to Angie from MGV, who's going to tell us a little bit about their community. Angie, are you ready?
Hi, My name is Ashley and I'm from Maitland Garden Village. Maitland Garden Village Housing Forum was established in 2018 after we had an engagement with our community. So what came forth was that we needed housing and we needed it as soon as we could get it. So what happened is we decided that we would be a community forum for the community. And since then, we have grown to working with DAG and other stakeholders. And what we have identified is that we are a community that are very centrally placed, but are still disconnected from the city. And we do have something prepared here that I would like to read. And some of it I will further explain as I'm going on. So yeah, the housing crisis in Maitland Garden Village. Our neighborhood was established in the 1920s as part of a segregated public housing scheme, built predominantly for colored municipal workers by the then City of Cape Town Council. It is now home to around 1,834 people spread across 363 households and accommodated in 229 semi-detached houses and numerous backyard structures. I think our backyard structures actually are more than the houses. So backyarding is a very big part of Maitland Garden Village, and it is a large family connected with most of the time the children of the landlords living in the back because they can't afford to move out or buy property elsewhere. An aerial desktop analysis of Garden Village revealed that 221 backyard structures were built between 2004 and 2020, with 305 such structures observable in 2020. Not all of these are necessarily occupied by different households, but most households do have backyard structures. This illustrates the clear demand for housing opportunities in the area, which is not being met through the formal housing market. The amount of backyard structures has placed pressure on the infrastructural services in the area as these were not designed to accommodate the current densities. In 2020, there were up to 20 people living on a single plot in the area, which is placing intense strain on the infrastructure. Many of these backyard tenants utilize the same toilets and other facilities as the main landlords, which can result in up to 20 people sharing a single water connection or toilet. For many, these overcrowded living conditions are unavoidable due to the lack of alternative opportunities for affordable housing in the area. The only other option is to seek housing opportunities elsewhere and thus to be displaced from this well-located neighborhood. Many of those who live in Maitland Garden Village have deep historical and familial connections to the neighborhood, which such displacement would isolate them from. Maitland Garden Village is also underprovided for in terms of a number of crucial facilities. Most importantly, the neighborhood needs access to a health clinic, library, and high school. If the portions of land identified or developed, these should provide sufficient facilities to accommodate the residents of MGV. The situation makes it clear that the residents of Garden Village are in need of affordable and suitable housing opportunities. If the vacant land parcels earmarked for housing development in the district plans are indeed developed to involve us, we would love to have inclusionary housing, and this will benefit all the neighboring residents of MGV. Also, we were joking about it as we were actually coming here to have this conversation with you guys. And we are so centrally located, but we are unable to even just walk to the front road of our area and get a taxi, even though how many taxis are passing us. So it just means like we've been there for 100 years and we haven't even been acknowledged by the city in a manner of transport. And that's such a small or key component to daily living, basically. So another thing that we have identified is poor consultation. So there's hardly any engagement with our community, and in the least, we would have liked to be acknowledged, for people to know that we exist, and for them to just let us understand that we know you are here and that we know you are experiencing housing issues, and we are making a plan, because there's been no engagement, they never include us in anything. And what we have recently found out is that we have we've had this massive golf course at the back of us for years. And if you look at our average monthly rent for a backyard in Maitland Garden Village, it will be 1,043 Rand. And then the golf courses, the rates will be like 1,000 Rand. And that's an insult to us living in the backyard. So if this was passed, or if the president do get it right to have this land released, it would actually mean a lot to our community, because it would mean housing for people who have been living in a shack or a backyard almost all their life. Children that were born in the backyard will eventually be able to have their own home. So thank you.
Thank you, Unati and Angie. I think those reflections from them really brings this issue home and brings it to the heart of the matter. And it's that our people need homes, and they need to be situated in areas where they're able to access all of the amenities needed that would give them a decent life. It's not just about having a roof over your head. It's about living in a neighborhood that allows you to live a decent and orderly life, and where you can advance yourself and create a better life for yourself and your family. So right now we have some time for questions and answers. I'm going to ask Ryan and Michael to get themselves ready, and also Unati and Ashley to answer some of these questions. I think I'm going to start with the first one, and just a reminder to everybody else, if you still have questions, please put them in the chat box. Otherwise, just put your name in the chat box, and then I'll give you an opportunity to pose the question to any of the speakers. Adi, you should also prepare yourself to respond to some of the questions if it applies to you. So the first question is, was the northern portions of Wingfield also considered, or the so-called North Camp? I think Ryan or Michael can respond to this. And then somebody said, I know this meeting is focusing on the release of military land, but does anyone know what's happening with the Salt River Market Precinct and Communique precinct that Communique developed a proposal for? Michael or Adi? Is there clarity on the capacity of schools and clinics, not just the numbers? I'm not quite sure what is meant about clarity on the capacity, but maybe Ryan or Michael, you could take a stab at that. And then maybe just some reflections on density. I'm sure you've both looked at the comments or the chat box where there's a conversation going on around density. Maybe if either one of the two of you, Michael or Ryan, could maybe give just some reflections about how we came to the densities and what was sort of the rationale behind it. Maybe just reiterate what you've said in the presentation also. And then finally, if anybody has any burning issues, please, like I said, just put your name in the chat box and I'll follow up as we go on. I'll give you guys time to respond, a chance to respond. Michael, do you want to go first? I can see you.
I was actually going to say, I think I want to give Ryan the chance to respond. I think a lot of those questions were specifically about the plan. Ryan, would you feel comfortable where there's something else that I want to add? I can just come in.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to clarify with Curida, which site was it that they wanted the answer on the north part? Is it Youngsfield or
Wingfield?
Wingfield, okay.
Wingfield.
Yeah, so to respond to that question, we actually considered all of Wingfield, including the northern part of the site initially. But when I think maybe a few weeks into the development of the submission, we actually realized when we did some more investigation around Wingfield, we found that there was existing activities going on in the northern part of the site. And I think if I could remember correctly, it was also had some very sensitive environmental features. So we left the northern part of the site out because of the existing activity, but we've just included the sort of the major part of Wingfield below, I think it's Acacia train station. In terms of the question around density, I think this is something that the team grappled with quite a lot in the development of the proposal, because there was different densities that we could have proposed. I think one of the big questions is around the ability of the bulk infrastructure to sustain that densities, which is not always possible, especially for Youngsfield. So it was a question around bulk infrastructure and the ability to sustain density, but also whether or not in Cape Town we kind of have and I think in South Africa in general, we have a very bad perception of high density living, especially if you look at some of the areas where high density living is often correlated with gangsterism or high violent areas, you know, and poverty. So it was important to think about that, but we do have a group discussion coming up later where we're also going to ask that question around density and what do we think is the right densities for the site. I think the main idea of the density is to capitalize, to not undercapitalize on what these sites are offering. I'm sure we can agree that 40 dwelling units per hectare, which is I think usually what RDP housing comes in at, is far too low for these sites which are so well located to public transport and economic opportunities. But we need to think about density a bit differently and not have this always bad perception we do have of density. And then I just wrote the other question down here. Yeah, I think also when it comes to development, I think the big thing is also that these sites really do have some great sensitivity environmentally, and that has to be respected. And that in itself is another process, you know, in respecting those things. So yeah, those things were considered, but at the same time, we had to be very conceptual. And, you know, with the small team that we had, we couldn't go into great detail about everything, but that is when these sites are ready to be released and ready to be developed, then I think a more detailed planning and feasibility study needs to be done.
And maybe just to add in relation to the question about school sites, just to add one small point, which is that in the city's own district plans for the area, Wingfield has already been identified as a potential site for new development. So there is definitely an awareness definitely from the spatial components of the city, as well as other elements of the city, that there would be a need for better capacity for things like schools, and definitely some focus on bulk infrastructure would have to be undertaken to just make sure that the bulk infrastructure would be able to carry these higher densities. But I just wanted to add that as well.
Can I just respond to one of the that was raised a little bit earlier around affordability and what do we mean by affordable housing? I think that is a fundamental question that needs to be responded to. In some ways, so there are two kind of complementary debates around affordable housing and what it means. There are some sections of the housing code which are very clear in terms of what affordability means, whether affordability deals with the same income bands and under what income you qualify for what type of housing. So for instance, and people with greater knowledge can clarify for me, but like social housing ranges between 1,500 and 15,000 Rand household income. So anybody within that would get a subsidized rental in well-located areas. And that's generally considered kind of household income, which would qualify as, or would make you eligible to qualify for affordable housing or social housing. Obviously, the BNG and RDP1 has consistently stood since the early days. Anything under 3,500 Rand would qualify you, at least on a waiting list, to be to receive a government subsidized house. But I think part of the thing that we're trying to understand here, I think Kenneth raised that point, is what should be the criteria and how should the mix be determined, not on the basis of income, but also in the basis of household sizes and how that plays itself out, whether it should be ownership models, whether it should be rental models, and how it needs to be reflected into things like the district planning processes and the SDF and so on. So I think we acknowledge that these answers aren't exactly clear, but it does require some serious consultation that needs to take place with the public and the citizens of the city to decide and determine affordable for who and how much of that stock has to be affordable for which segment of the population. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Adi. I see there are two more questions that are quite specific in the chat box. The last one by Mark and the other, there's no name, but it concerns how the sites are being used potentially for land restitution, whether we've considered that. So I'm going to suggest that those people that asked those questions, that you ask them again in the groups. For now, we are going to move over to breakout groups. And within the breakout groups, we have 3. So the first one is, or group 1 rather, is going to discuss the developmental potential of the sites. And Annalyn and Ryan will be your moderators there. Group 2 is going to discuss advocacy strategies. Michael will be your moderator. And then group 3 will discuss implementation guidelines. Chardonnay will be your moderators there. So if you have any burning questions, please ask them or share them with your group also. And I'm sure when the moderators return to plenary, they'll bring those questions or burning issues up again. I'm going to ask that we now move into breakaway groups. Adam? I think you should get a pop-up on your screen asking you to join a particular group. Just please, when you see the pop-up box, just click on join, and that should automatically take you into the group.
I only see one box here. Group 3. Where are the others?
I beg your pardon?
I said I can only see one box, which is group 3. Where are the others?
We pre-assigned. So
Oh, you pre-assigned. Okay, thank you.
yes, sir. Sure, that's a long question. We've pre-assigned the groups. So unfortunately, you have to click on the group to which we've assigned you to. Just going to give everybody about a minute to return to the main room. Okay. I think we're going to give the group moderators an opportunity now to give some feedback from the discussions that they had in the breakaway groups. I'm going to start with group 1. Annalyn, would you like to give us some feedback, please?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Clarita. Okay, so my group had discussed the development potential of the sites, and in discussing this, we had discussed essentially 3 questions. So I'll let everybody hear the question, and then of course I will give feedback for each question. So the first one was, what facilities are lacking or need improvement in your area? And the feedback that we had received, and also thanks to my group for participating. I know that due to time, we couldn't get to everybody's responses or comments. What had come through in respect of that was safety is an issue in the group. There's high gangsterism levels. Communities are forced to form their own neighborhood watches. Public institutions are not working, or if people need access to public institutions, they've got to travel some distance just to get to to access whether it's the clinics. Of course, another issue is that they have difficulty accessing youth skill projects. I'm sorry, I'm just going through all of my notes. Oh yes, and of course, another issue that was raised is that they see that within the area, and this was one of the participants that reside in Bishop Lavis had actually said that what they see is that land in their area has been sold to developers who are now selling the property at market prices, so that they see some development happening in their land, in their neighborhood, but they're not able to just access that. It's not easy to access that housing. So that was in response to number 1. The second question that we had asked is, what do you envision this development site to look like now being given an opportunity to discuss the development potential of building a new neighborhood? One of the things that people had mentioned is that in terms of building these new sites is that one of the members spoke about they live close to Wingsfield, and before these sites are developed, there needs to be, of course, EIAs, environment impact assessments, that need to be done, where they need to look at the traffic infrastructure. Also, they need to look at the number of schools, because currently in the neighborhood there is well, they don't have, it's very difficult for them to access the N1. And now if we are talking about adding thousands of households to this neighborhood, you know, they need to upgrade the transport facilities. Also in terms of schools, they need to consider this, the number of people moving in. Another thing that was raised was also in terms of clinics. There needs to, all of that needs to be considered. So another thing was, I had another speaker speak from Bontihivo, where he said in his area there's only one hospital, one day hospital. So of course, again, with a new neighborhoods being built, all of these infrastructure considerations need to be taken into account. Also, the manner in which the homes are going to be built. There would need to be more consideration around crowding, and how many homes are going to be built on 1 hectare of land. And the third question that we had covered was what type of housing is required for these new sites. And thanks to one of the participants, Crystal, who had advised that what she, of course, envisions, or what would be something that would need to be considered as mixed use residential housing. And of course, just in her experience, is that in the past, that where people are, where there's not mixed use development, some people are targeted based on their social or economic standing within the community. And that I do agree with, in that these homes, there needs to be inclusionary housing. Yeah, and then of course, again, the issue of the infrastructure had come up, in that in creating new neighborhoods, all of that needs to be considered. So thank you all. That was the feedback from my group.
Thank you, Annalyn. I'm immediately going to hand over to Michael, who was in group 2, where they discussed advocacy strategies. Michael?
Thanks so much, Curator. Yes, our group had a very fruitful and interesting discussion. A large part of our discussion was about the fact that we essentially need to bring in the other different decision makers and voices in the room. And that will be a key part of being able to really make this be a proactive and powerful strategy. In relation to that, a lot of people specifically mentioned that we definitely need buy-in from the city and from the province, understanding that they've already committed to these sites, already identified these sites as important sites. We need to bring them on board so that that can actually be particularly useful. Ivan specifically mentioned here that they also have a lot of technical skills that would be able to call for and assist with the gaps that currently exist in the submission itself, and ways to plug those gaps. There was also a mention that we need to be very aware of the other people who need to be in the room, so that we don't end up getting blocked at a later stage. So Mandisa specifically said it's not just the Minister of Rural Development, not just the Minister of Public Works that's involved here, but we need to bring in the other ministers as well, so that we really have these people all in the room, all together, aggressively bring them along, because otherwise we might face that these decisions are being blocked at a later stage. There was a very good point made by Ivan about the need for us to really put the submission in analytical terms, or put in an analytical analysis into this. So looking at the costs of infrastructure, the costs of building, the revenue that could potentially be generated from rates, and better off housing, and really looking at the commercial potential in some of these sites, and how that can be cross-subsidized, because that would really add credence to this call, and really also show that it's not all the money is just coming from the national government itself, as well as some interesting points about the city sitting on large reserves of money, and being quite conservative in its approach to finances, and how there's a potential there to ask the city to use some money and invest some of its funds into this project as a kind of indication of good faith that could really put forward a lot of buy-in from other different groups. We then had a bit of a discussion about the beneficiaries. Lots of people asking questions about beneficiaries. There being specific questions about people who live quite close to Wingfield, in a kind of almost informal settlement around there, and whether those people could be accommodated or other people could be accommodated. And then and those kinds of questions are kind of mostly outlying, but really just coming back to like an emphasis on the need to build wide-ranging support because other people are really interested in these sites. And then we had a couple of comments just about the importance of really creating awareness around this, social media, traditional media like radio, etc., to really make this stand out a little bit more clearly, and a call to really bring more community voices into the room on an ongoing basis, and really broaden the alliance. There was a point that was made that none of these things need to be made, none of these things are either or, but they need to come together, bringing an alliance together with working quite closely with the city or the province. And that's essentially it. If there are other points that other people had that I missed, please add them in at some point. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. We can't emphasize the community voice in all of this more. Finally, group 3, Chardonnay and Adi were moderating that group. I think Adi is going to give us feedback.
Thanks, Kirida. So we got quite stuck into flexibility around housing typologies. I think that was quite an important discussion that took place in the group. So whether social housing is one of the appropriate models, and how I think few people mentioned how tenancy as a tenure type has been quite jeopardized as a result of COVID. So whether it's on a private rental or whether it's through social housing companies, people have struggled to meet some of their commitments. So really the emphasis there was on quite a large amount of flexibility around the housing typology that ultimately gets envisioned on these particular parcels of land. The second kind of interesting discussion, and my group can correct me, was around the issue of self-build. And so while I think the person from Housing Assembly emphasized the fact that, there needs to be some kind of models of ownership that are built into this thing. But then I think interesting ideas were raised about self-build, but more medium density that would allow both, effective use of resources in some ways, but also allow for people to build their own type of housing opportunities as they deem fit. So that was quite an interesting contribution there. A lot of the kind of input was around figuring out what support exists for social housing at the moment. So whether there is enough input that's required, or whether there's enough support that's provided through social housing companies, or whether government could do more to protect the rights of tenants, particularly in social housing complexes, and whether the focus should shift towards other housing programs like the community residential units, and perhaps reconsider how RDP/BNG type houses could be developed in a different way. The one issue that we did not end up speaking about, which I was a bit surprised myself, but something that perhaps people want to raise ultimately, is the issue of public participation. Is how do we envision? So tomorrow, if the minister comes out and says we want to release these parcels of land, what kind of process would government need to follow, or what we think should be an appropriate process? But we didn't end up talking about that as we ran out of time. But yeah, that's it from my side, Kirida. If Chardonnay or any of the others want to add, please feel free to do so.
Thanks, Ari. Chardonnay, are you here? Would you like to contribute?
Yeah. I think the only point I'd like to add, Kirida, is the fact that I thought it was quite a good point, that we should think of a transitional arrangement that, so you might qualify for a house today, but maybe in 5 years' time, your economic situation changes and what that looks like, and how that's impacting, beneficiaries, but who would qualify at one point and then later not, and how they supported. And I think that the comment that Adi made about proper consultation, I think there needs to be an ongoing process to help think about solutions to that problem, because there was quite a lengthy discussion around affordability and how that changes. And then also like what is affordable housing and who is it for was also discussed at length. Another good point that just brought up was the South build, and maybe we could look at an option where there is your, I would call your grade A builders, they build up to a point that maybe provide foundations with surrounding halls, and then you can get like some more local contractors to build the unit complete, if it's a single unit or a 3-story walk up to a point, so that building costs are kept to an affordability point or to a minimum. We didn't unfortunately get to the discussion about like really different tenure options and debates on like in Sutu and that kind of thing. But yeah, these discussions, they were quite helpful and gives quite a broad perspective, and also gives some views as to right now how the pandemic has impacted a lot of communities, and obviously further exacerbated people like and their financial means and how they would qualify or not. Thank you.
Sure. That sounds like it was a very, very interesting conversation. I said earlier that we want to talk about the nuts and bolts of actually using these sites. And it seems like there was a good start in terms of actually talking to some of those issues. And now we've almost come to the end of our meeting today. And Charlton from Cork has the pleasure of summarizing everything that was said today and telling us what the way forward is going to be. So I'm going to hand over to Charlton to give us a summary and the way forward. Charlton, are you ready?
Yes, let me just turn on my camera. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's really so good to have such excellent participation in this public meeting. It was clear from the discussion today that this topic is highly complex. It's been something that's been on the table for many years. And I think that there's obviously been many attempts to try and get this going. Where we are at, so yes, I'm going to speak a little bit to the summary as well, to say that in listening to today's discussion, there were some things that just stood out very strongly for me. So I wanted to remind ourselves of a couple of things. Unati stuck in my mind when he spoke about the proximity of privilege and how their location actually afforded them the opportunity for self-sufficiency. So that stuck in my head throughout this discussion. Then Ashley, the one comment which really stuck out for me, and she was laughing about it, but if you think about it, it's quite a hectic comment. The one about the average rental for the backyard in Making Garden Village, and how the rates for the entire golf course just behind them is the equivalent. And I remember what she said, this is an insult to us. So I want to pick up on those community inputs, and then being in the group discussions, what came out quite strongly for me was this idea of how there's so much knowledge within this group that we have to consider. And I think particularly in our group around, we had some members from trade-based associations in, I believe it was Ponteville, and also in the, I can't remember where the second one was from, but what was interesting was how people reflected on thinking about these developments, but also reminding us that there's a need to look at current situations in communities that are already developed. And I think about someone who said these words, first redress some of the plague that apartheid left in these communities. And the picture I got in my mind was almost like an organic one, where if you start to water, you start looking after a particular piece of plant now, and the surrounding plants are not looked after in the same kind of way. Yes, you've got this new plant growing, but you also have the potential to cause damage in the surrounds. So it's very interesting because it's asking us to actually grapple with this in a very integrated approach. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in all of this. It's always about working with pieces of things, as opposed to having everybody trying to have this combined vision. So just in thinking about the way forward, I know we touched on this a little bit in the start, but around this submission, it's really about the call, a rally to get behind the submission. And yes, there's definitely a housing crisis in our city. Yes, we do need new land for that housing. But it's also asking for us to look at how we address this in a very integrated and unified approach. But there is still the importance of the submission, because we do need to look at that very real crisis. So for us, in terms of looking at some of these next steps, there's of course this continued push for engagements with the various government stakeholders to try and unlock the process. I think I did reflect on the fact that, Karida, that we were meant to meet with the minister today. But again, that's one cog of the puzzle. There are definitely other ministries that will have to apply this pressure to. But in terms of our process, the engagement, definitely to continue on that path. It's also the bigger thing about maintaining the pressure. And I think that's probably a reflection of this process, if you look at it over the decades, is that there needs a concerted effort and a maintenance of that pressure, because it's easy for it to let up. Somebody in the groups mentioned the fact that we've got the local elections coming and we know the games that get played. And we need to think of this as that longer term game where we're only going to win if we keep applying this pressure, not letting up. So that pressure has to come both from the organizations. So we spoke about this group of organizations, but it's also about gaining more of that community voice from across the city to raise their voices in support of this and to speak about, and I think today was quite eye-opening for me as well, to also understand how these new developments will link to the other communities that already exist and how it won't become an issue of creating a drain, but enhancing that opportunities. Yeah, so if anything, I'm asking everyone in this public meeting when we go away from here is to think about how we're going to maintain this pressure. Yes, our set of organizations, we're going to continue to push, but definitely the more voices we add to this, the greater chance we have of success in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlton. That was excellent. A very succinct but also comprehensive summary of the discussions today. We've come to the end of today's public meeting, and I just want to thank everybody that participated throughout the meeting, but especially in the breakout rooms. Just listening to the moderators in their report back and listening to Charlton, you can hear that there really is a lot of enthusiasm around what the work that is happening here and what needs to happen forward, but also urgency in terms of getting these sites released and ensuring that there is development, but not only that, the right kind of development on these sites. So again, everybody, thank you for taking the time and for participating and for your efforts going forward, working with us to build momentum around the submission and the ask in the submission and carrying this process forward. I also want to thank specifically the NGO coalition partners, Cork, LRC, NU, Professor Vanessa Watson and DAG, everybody that worked on the submission, and going forward we'll continue to do some more work on this. I've asked the partners to put their web addresses in the chat room, but if not, if you have any further questions or you want to follow up on anything, you can, I see Michael has put up there, and Dag's address is also in the chat room. Please look at the chat rooms, get those addresses. If you have any additional information after this meeting or questions that you want to ask, please go to those websites or find the telephone numbers there and make a call, but reach out to us. Similarly, NU later this week is going to be doing a radio interview where they'll be discussing these issues in depth. I think you can go to the Facebook page and see when exactly and where this radio interview is going to be. But at the end of it, I want to encourage everybody to take this upon yourselves, get involved, help us to build momentum around this and to keep the momentum going so that we can ensure that this actually goes to implementation, that we actually get these sites released so that it can start, to address the housing crisis that we have in Cape Town. Thank you also to all of my colleagues at DAG for assisting me and all of the NGO partners in getting this done. And thank you to yourselves again. With that said, I'm going to end the meeting. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.